With breaking news. Early this morning, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals denied the Trump administration's latest move to keep his travel ban in place. That means travelers from those 7 majority Muslim countries still free to come to America, just as they were before the president issued the executive order struck down by a federal judge in Seattle late Friday night. All through Saturday, there were joyful reunions at airports. But from the winter White House Mar-a-Lago, the president let loose on Twitter, calling the federal judge who blocked his ban a so-called judge. Later Saturday, he promised to fight. So far, the court's rulings have gone against the White House. And as this tussle between the president and the courts played out, I met with Vice President Mike Pence at the historic Congress Hall in Philadelphia, just steps away from where our Constitution was drafted. The president is vowing to overturn that order. This morning, he called it a ridiculous order from a so-called judge. So-called judge. Is it appropriate for the president to be questioning the legitimacy of a federal judge in that way?
Through the course of the campaign and in the early days of this administration, President Trump's made it clear that our administration is going to put the safety and security of the American people first. And the executive order that he put into effect, which suspends immigration from 7 countries that have been compromised by terrorism and don't have the kind of internal systems that we can be certain the people that are applying to come to this country are who they say they are, was legal, it was appropriate, and our administration is going to be using all legal means at our disposal to challenge the judge's order.
But is it right for the president to say so-called judge? Doesn't that undermine the separation of powers in the Constitution written right next door?
Well, I don't think it does. I think the American people are very accustomed to this president speaking his mind and speaking very straight with them, and it's very frustrating when scholars on the left and the right, people as distinguished as Jonathan Turley of George Washington University, have said while he doesn't agree with the executive order, he recognizes the president has the full authority to put the security of the homeland first in determining who comes into this country. But to see a judge actually suspend that order across the country, George, is frustrating all of us.
This is a judge who was nominated by President Bush, 99-0, confirmed. How is he a so-called judge?
Well, again, there's simply no question under the Constitution and frankly under federal law that the President of the United States has the authority in the interest of national security to determine who has the right to come into this country. And we're going to challenge the judge's order on that basis because the reality is we face a dangerous enemy and the President is determined to use the authority that he has under the Constitution and under the law, but we'll work through the courts to challenge them.
But doesn't this judge have the authority to do what he did as well?
He certainly does, and that's why the administration is complying with that order as we speak, and we'll go through the process in the courts to get a stay of that order so that, again, we can implement this action that is entirely focused on the safety and security of the American people. Look, we've got to do things differently, and the Obama administration and the last Congress identified these 7 countries repeatedly as 7 countries that have been compromised by terrorism. And so by putting a pause in, as Secretary Kelly described it accurately, putting a pause in for all these countries except Syria, and beginning to identify ways that we can ensure that anyone that's coming here doesn't represent a threat to our families and our communities, what the American people expect.
There's been a chorus of criticism, though, of this ban, as you know, from other courts, from our allies like Theresa May, the French president, from Republicans in Congress. When you look at how this was done, do you take away any lessons, concede it could have been done better, drafted better?
I think the early days of this administration are going to be described in the history books as days of action. And the American people welcome the decisiveness that President Trump has shown on this issue, putting the safety and security of the American people above the niceties of communicating with people in Washington or in some cases around the world. He acted, he put the safety of the American people first, and I think that's the kind of leadership the American people want to see.
Definitely some support. So a lot of resistance you've seen crop up as well. But I want to move on because the Democratic leader in the Senate has weighed in on this this morning as well. He's responding to the president's tweet this morning saying, with each action testing the Constitution and each personal attack on judges, President Trump raises the bar even higher for Judge Gorsuch's nomination to serve on the Supreme Court. You think it's going to have an impact?
Probably, you know, I look at the first few days of this administration, and I love to tell people to watch this president work sitting behind that resolute desk in the Oval Office. you see a president who's in the promise-keeping business. And in my view, chief among those promises was his commitment to nominate someone to the Supreme Court who will be faithful to the Constitution, interpret the law as written, but he also said he wanted someone who was exceptionally qualified. And Judge Neil Gorsuch, with his academic background, with 10 years on the court, as someone who was unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate 10 years ago to the Court of Appeals in the 10th Circuit, I think represents that promise kept to the American people. And we remain very confident that despite some of the posturing that we see in the Senate today, that Judge Gorsuch is going to be well received by members of the Senate. And I'll promise you, one way or the other, he's going to get an up or down vote on the floor of the Senate.
Whether it takes the nuclear option or not. President Trump also promised a pro-life justice. Judge Gorsuch has never ruled directly on Roe v. Wade. Are you confident that he would vote to overturn Roe v. Wade on the court?
You know, as someone who, like the president, cherishes the sanctity of life, that's an important issue to me, as it is for millions of Americans. But in this deliberation, and I was honored to be a part of the process.
You spoke with the judge, right?
I did, and the president asked me to be a part of a small group that interviewed all the finalists for this decision. But what the president directed us to look for was someone who would be faithful to the Constitution, who would simply apply the law as written, who would have the character, the temperament, and the courage that the American people want to see.
Did you ask him directly about Roe v. Wade?
I did not, and you know what the president charged us to do was to find someone who had the background, the experience, the unimpeachable credentials, the character, but also just to be faithful to the Constitution as written. We're in this hallowed hall where the Congress met in 1790. We're right next door to Independence Hall where the Constitution was written. That and the framework of this government have created the greatest quality of life in the history of mankind. And I'm confident that in Judge Neil Gorsuch, we'll have someone on the court who'll keep faith with the Constitution.
President Trump decided this week to let stand President Obama's executive order on LGBT rights. And it prompted this question from a prominent social conservative, Bob Vanderplatz. He said, our base is wondering why Obama's executive order is allowed to stand. What's the answer?
I think throughout the campaign, President Trump made it clear that discrimination would have no place in our administration. I mean, he was the very first Republican nominee to mention the LGBTQ community at our Republican National Convention and was applauded for it. And I was there applauding with him. I think the generosity of his spirit, recognizing that in the patriot's heart there's no room for prejudice, is part of who this president is. But I also think that the speech that he gave this week at the National Prayer Breakfast, reiterating his commitment to repeal the Johnson Amendment, that's put a chilling effect on free speech in religious institutions around the country, and his reiterated commitment to religious liberty, are all a part of the kind of leadership that people are going to welcome. Do you think a new executive order is necessary on religious liberty, or is current law sufficient? Well, the president's made it clear that he wants to take action on the Johnson Amendment. Back in the 1950s, the Congress passed a law that essentially threatened the tax-exempt status of churches and synagogues and religious institutions if they were seen to be involved in political expression. I have to tell you, I don't think we'd have ever made it to these hallowed halls back in 1790 if the pulpits of this country had been silenced from speaking about what they thought was right and wrong. And the president provided real leadership in the campaign where he identified the Johnson Amendment, and he told people of faith of every background across this country that he would work to repeal it. And he's directed the administration to begin to look at ways, both legislatively and through executive action, to do that.
But no executive orders beyond that, beyond fixing the Johnson Amendment, in your view?
Well, I think that'll be the purview of the president to determine whether any of that's necessary. But I will tell you, for our part, the focus of this administration will continue to be to have a safer America, to have a more prosperous America, and to continue to advance the president's agenda both on Capitol Hill and through executive action, and carry that message all across the country.
The president took executive action on Iran yesterday, imposed those new sanctions. We saw General Flynn say Iran is on notice. What does that mean exactly?
It means we're watching.
What are we watching for?
It means Iran would do well to look at the calendar and realize there's a new president in the Oval Office. And Iran would do well not to test the resolve of this new president.
What would testing the resolve be?
Well, the ballistic missile tests that were done in the last week were in direct violation of UN Security Council resolutions dealing with limiting them in that regard. That's the reason why the president took the decisive action that he took to impose economic sanctions on their supply chain for their missile program. But also, let's recognize that the Houthi rebels in Yemen are fully subsidized by Iran, and the attack that the Houthis leveled using Iranian arms against a Saudi Arabian ship this last week all represent the kind of hostile and belligerent actions that are simply not going to be tolerated.
That might require military action. The president said everything's on the table.
The president said everything's on the table. But look, the Iranians got a deal from the international community that, again, the president and I and our administration think was a terrible deal. It essentially allows Iran to develop a nuclear weapon in the years ahead at a date certain. And they received hundreds of millions of dollars in cash.
But Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson say we have to stand by that deal now. Is that administration policy?
Well, we're evaluating that as we speak.
But Secretary Mattis didn't say he's evaluating the deal. He said the U.S. has to stand by it. Is that administration policy?
Well, I think the president will make that decision in the days ahead, and he'll listen to all of his advisors. But make no mistake about it, the resolve of this president is such that Iran would do well to think twice about their continued hostile and belligerent actions.
Russia has been violating the ceasefire in Ukraine. Are they on notice as well?
We're watching and very troubled by the increased hostilities over the past week in eastern Ukraine. I know the president had a conversation with Vladimir Putin.
Did he say he was troubled?
They spoke at that time about Ukraine, and I expect those conversations are going to be ongoing. But look, I think there's a growing recognition in the world community that there's a new style of leadership, not just a new leader in the White House. President Trump is bringing a very candid and direct type of leadership to the White House. And in conversations with leaders around the world, frankly, I think they all find it very refreshing.
Some of them find it unsettling.
Well, and to the extent that we have a president who's got broad shoulders and is willing to put the interests of the American people first and speak directly to leaders about the world about America's interests, that may be unsettling to some, but I think it's very encouraging to millions of Americans.
So, but will the sanctions on Russia remain in place as long as Russia is violating the ceasefire in Ukraine?
I think that's a question that will be answered in the months ahead, and it just simply all depends on whether or not we see the kind of changes in posture by Russia and the opportunity perhaps to work on common interests. I mean, the president's made it clear the top priority of this administration is to hunt down and destroy ISIS at its source. He's directed our military commanders and our Secretary of State to collaborate and to develop a strategy in the region to bring together the resources and the allies necessary to do that. Russia has a common interest in confronting radical Islamic terrorism and especially ISIS. And if we have opportunities to work together, I think the president is looking for an opportunity to begin that relationship anew. But make no mistake about it, those decisions will await action, and they'll be very dependent on how the Russians respond in the days ahead.
We're just about out of time. I want to ask you about Obamacare. Senator Lamar Alexander came out this week. He's the chair of the Health Committee, and he says you have to start talking about repairing Obamacare, not replacing. Here's what he said exactly. He's compared it to an old bridge. He said, don't close it until the new one is complete. In the meantime, we repair it. No one is talking about repealing anything until there's a concrete alternative in place. Does the president accept that?
Well, I think what the senator was talking about was simply the process. What the president has said is that we are going to repeal Obamacare, which has put a tremendous burden on families across this country. We have some states across America, George, where health insurance premiums have gone up more than 100%. And the president made it clear to the Congress right after the election that he wanted to see us move on repealing the most corrosive elements, the mandate, the taxes, the penalties of Obamacare. But he's also made it very clear that at the same time that we repeal Obamacare, we're going through both executive action and through legislation set into motion a replacement of Obamacare that will be orderly and will lead the American people to a system based on free market
principles. It doesn't have to be
complete,
the replacement before repeal.
Well, when he gave that speech here in Philadelphia during the course of the campaign on Obamacare, he talked about a commitment to repeal and replace this deeply flawed legislation.
Not repair.
But he also said it would be an orderly transition. And the way I interpret what the senator said, George, is that we're going to ensure that we have that orderly transition. But the American people know we can do better. We can lower the cost of health insurance without growing the size of government, with mandates and with taxes. The president's committed to that. And I have to tell you, we're very encouraged by the support and the partnership of leadership in the House and Senate in achieving just that.
Going to pick a winner in the Super Bowl?
I'm going to go and cheer them on. I'm an Indianapolis Colts fan, so I'll be on neutral ground in the Houston Owners Suite. And what a privilege it'll be to be there with President George Herbert Walker Bush. We're so pleased. I know the president is pleased to see him doing well there for the coin toss, and to be able to be there to celebrate that great tradition in the company of some of America's heroes will be a great privilege for Karen and me.
Have a good time. Nice to see you, sir.
Thanks, George.
Bye-bye.